Hello, viewers. I'm Vibhuti Jha. This is Jaipur Dialogue USA. Welcome to the show. Just as always, I request you please like, subscribe, support our channel, press the bell icon, and give your feedback. We try to understand your message as well. Today is a very crucial day. On January 1st, while the New Year celebrations were going on, we all now know how and what happened in New Orleans. One of the most important part in this entire conversation is it is not the last one. It will happen again somewhere. That's why I'm saying Islamist terror, where next? What can we do about it? Are we going to live with it as a fait accompli because we can't question anything? And what is sad is that any conversation that happens about Islamist terror, and hundreds of them that have happened before in various parts of the world, it always gets branded as Islamophobia. That's a problem. The moment you say Islamist terror, the ecosystem somewhere along the line, the media system somewhere along the line, blames everybody who talks about it, like you and I, as Islamophobia. Now, the question is, how do you counter that? To talk about this entire issue, I have great pleasure in welcoming our returning friend, Mr. Rahul Sur, whom you definitely know by now that he was a former IPS officer in a very senior position in Maharashtra government, and he has had a very checkered career in United Nations, where he worked in conflict resolution in various parts of the world and has done significant work in understanding Islam as and what United Nations itself talks about it. That's critical. So, Rahulji, shoot away to my first inquiry.
No, no,
How does
namaste.
one handle this Islamophobic attack? And how does one get over the nomenclature of the whole thing? Thank you very much for joining
Namaste,
today.
Vibhuti. And first of all, a very happy new year to you and to your viewers.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say that really the first thing is that our thought should really go out to the people whose lives have been shattered and taken away by this evil and by the people who will forever remain impacted by it. So let us really give them remember them, keep them close to our hearts. The fact that they have now been branded by this evil for their life, and keep them in our prayers. Now, in terms of the question which you have raised, Islamophobia, that when you start talking about these issues, Islamist issues, you are branded as an Islamophobe, then the first thing we should do is that is there an objective norm on which we can rely on to see whether our talk or conversation is Islamophobic or not. And for that reason, there is no better place to turn to than the United Nations itself. And a report which was put out by a Muslim gentleman, Mr. Shahid Ahmad, on Islamophobia, in which he has clearly said that criticism of Islam, of its symbols and leaders and personalities, is not in itself Islamophobic. And he considers Islamophobic, quote, a contested term which has been dangerously and inappropriately used against, quote, majoritarian interpretations of Islam, women's human rights activists, and even Muslim minorities in Muslim majority countries. So, therefore, there is nothing which says that Islam cannot be discussed. We are living in the United States, which has got the freedom of speech. And even in Europe, the freedom of speech, in order to, even though it offends and it shocks, is a part of the law of the European Union and of the UK. So, therefore, keeping this in mind, what we are talking about is certainly not Islamophobic. But there is another angle to that. And that is that when the people say you should not talk about Islam, then there is also the question of reciprocity. That is, does Islam talk or not talk about non Muslims? And when we delve into the Quranic texts and the hadiths, we find that it has a lot of not very pleasant things to say about non Muslims. So, therefore, there has to be reciprocity. But keeping in mind that these are the international norms, and that international norms, international human rights law protects individuals and not religions, what we are going to be speaking about is not Islamophobic, it is based on facts, Vibhutiji.
Talking about based on facts, this is one of you talked about hadith and some of the Islamic tenets. You and I are not even allowed to, you're not supposed to even talk about Islamic rules and regulations. This is what happened to Nupur Sharma and the many people who have spoken before or after. That's this big problem, is that you and I are not even allowed to. So when you refer to this book by this gentleman, it needs to be known, because we get terrorized by those very people the moment you make a mention of that. We have enough number of instances. The classic one was Charlie Hebdo. We have Nupur Sharma. I mean, it's a matter of great concern. And you use the word reciprocity. That's my favorite word. My favorite word is, when will the word demand reciprocity from others about your own self? I'm not talking about Hindu or India or anybody. But as an example, I would say that if you have the right to criticize my way of life, then I have the right, same freedom of speech, to make an inquiry about what you do and how you do it. So this is what is important, and we will go about the conversation definitely. And my warm remembrance to the departed souls from the New Orleans thing and New Orleans tragedy. But here is another question that comes to my mind. This person was an army veteran. Tell us something about the background of this man and what potentially could have motivated, because this is not the first soldier Islamic faith in the US Army who has been into war and has done attacks on American military establishments. Forget about the civilian, that is another part. So tell us about the background of that gentleman
Yes.
who did that. I don't even want to say gentleman, but the killer. Let's call him a killer.
The terrorist, this
Yes,
terrorist.
yes.
So this is a very interesting case because when we delve into this man's history and psychology and actions, we find very, very important evidentiary leads. Now, who was he? First of all, that he was a US citizen. In other words, it was not that he was a foreign person, but he was radicalized inside. Number two, he was a convert to Islam, apparently in the early part of his life. Then he was a complete failure in his personal life because he was divorced twice. And the fact that it is rather ironical that he's also the recipient of a medal on the global war of terror. I mean, this is, it is so strange that he got that the medal, but he did. Now, in terms of his personal life, he was a US Army soldier, and his actions when they led up to the attack are very revealing. That he had wanted to kill his family before that, but he decided not to kill them because he thought the media that would detract from the media narrative of his war against unbelievers. So, therefore, to his mind, this was a religious act. And you have to understand that the gulf between his moral and ideological convictions that he was doing something good, he was doing something beneficial, he was doing something which is pleasing to God and Allah, are some things which should really be taken into account when we are studying the motivation of these people. Now, in terms of his US Army background, I just want to point out to the viewers that he is not the first US Army man to have done that. People will remember that the Fort Hood incident in 2009, in which Major Hassan Nadal, he had killed a lot of people and he had shouted, Allah Akbar when he was, killing the people. And when the Taliban won in Afghanistan recently, he sent a message of congratulation to them. And most, I think it was rather obscene that the Obama administration had qualified this earlier as an act of workplace violence. So, therefore, these people are not immune to being radicalized, even though they are in the US military, was supposed to be guarding America from external enemies, but they turned out to be America's enemies from within. In his house, they also found a Quran, which was open on a page in which talked about martyrdom and killing killing infidels. So we know from his actions that this was a purely religious act. And that is the most important thing to see. This motivation was religious. And unless and until we accept that and we stop foisting our theories of what motivated these people, they are not motivated by poverty, and it has been conclusively proven. Their motivation is a combination of religious and political. This was animating him. It is absolutely clear from his actions.
Now, you said about the workplace violence. This is truly remarkable. It was a very sad way, the politically correct way to do so, so to say, that you don't displease people. But another question comes up. This was a question that came about yesterday also yesterday I was on Times Now for a discussion on this case. And people talked about gun violence. But in this particular case, a vehicle was used. And this is not, again, the first time. Now they are using a truck. They use truck, and we know that in Germany and France and a couple of other places, they have driven past using vehicles. It's a vehicle jihad and a new instrument of terror. How do you define that part? How well organized they are that they will use anything, any tool available to them to pursue their ugly path. That's what is important.
Yeah.
You can track gun buy, but what can you do about car now? What can you do about the truck now? Let's tell me something
So
about.
This is, as you had correctly pointed out, that this is not the first instance of what we call vehicular jihad. You will remember that in 2016, there was a big attack in Nice, in
Yes,
France, which killed about 86 people.
correct.
Then in 2016, there was an attack on a Christmas market in Germany, which killed, I think, 5, 6 people. There was an attack in Sweden. There was an attack in Columbus, Ohio in 2017, in which a person had used a vehicle again to drive into people. There was an attack in 2017 where when a terrorist had used exactly the same methodology in Lower Manhattan. There was an attack in Pulwama, India in 2019. Now, the question is, why are they using trucks or cars as vehicles? Now, this is not accidental, this is by design. And the story behind this is that ISIS has a magazine. That magazine has undergone changes in its name, but in 2016, it was a magazine called Rumayya. By Rumayya, they mean Rome. And this name was derived from a hadith in which Muhammad said that Muslims are going to conquer Constantinople and Rome. And in that, they touted the advantages of using these trucks as a quote, ultimate mowing machine, that they were easy to get. And, in terms of methodology, if you make a bomb, you can get it blown up yourself. It's a technically difficult task. Getting a weapon is also dangerous. And the thing which is the easiest to do is to get a vehicle and drive it into pedestrians. Now, this is literally an impossible crime to prevent because you cannot put a ban on people renting vehicles. At the most, what you can do is you can harden soft targets, what they had done in this case in Christmas markets. But there are so many soft targets. Any pedestrian crossing, literally any pedestrian crossing, which is used by more than 10 people, or any amount of people, presents a target. And all you have to do is you just have to be endowed with that maniac religious political zeal, and you have a terrorist attack. So therefore, they have been urging Muslims to do this. And this is a part of a methodology in which they have called upon these lone wolf attacks. And they've been doing it for a long time. So, therefore, we had been warned by Christopher Wray that the threat level in the United States, he said, is a whole new level. And in France, they have said, in MI6, in the UK, they have said that 75% of the resources are devoted to Islamist terror. And the head of the French intelligence has said that they want to make Europe into Islamic Sharia. So, therefore, we are up against a very, very determined, convinced opponent, which will use any and all means. And this vehicular jihad is only one manifestation of that, but it is a carefully thought out one.
Very well said. But this also brings about what you refer to the lone wolf theory. Now, this brings about a conversation that the lone wolf, why did he do it? It is not only criminality, it is driven by ideological roots. And that's what is something very important for us to configure. Now, where does these ideological roots come? Because there are many videos circulating around in which the video is very explicit in its statement that this group of people have problem whoever they live with, whichever country they live in. They have a problem with everybody. There is nobody who is not a problem. They have a problem with. I mean, it's a very poetic description. The Muslims have problem with Christians. They have problem with Hindus. They have problem with Buddhists. They have problem in UK. They have problem in Europe. They have problem in India. They have problem in US. Everywhere they go, they have a problem. So the question here is, what is the cause of that? What is the cause of that? And how does one address that? Europe seems to have, and you refer to Europe going through under a Sharia regime. Even Texas had to debate and file a lawsuit that Sharia is not applicable in America. So are they taking advantage of democracy and the freedoms that exist in us? Your thoughts on it?
Yes, so in terms of, what causes terrorism, there are, many conflicting opinions in this, and many experts have weighed in. But let us have a look at, for instance, what the some of the apologists, what they say is that it is caused by socio-economic poverty, etc., etc. This has been conclusively disproven in many, many cases. And when I was looking at this, I said, okay, if you have a look at the United Nations documents, the official line of the United Nations is that terrorism should not and cannot be associated with any religion or civilization. That's the UN party line. But if you delve deeper into it, the European Union has a paper on the root causes of violent terrorism. And what does it say? It says, obviously, there is a multifactorial things. There are many pathways. There are many permutations and combinations which can lead people to become terrorists. But it says two very important things. One is that these people believe in a quote, jihadi Salafi interpretation of Islam, number one. Number two, that they are driven by a sense of political grievance in which they want to fight for the ummah and that the world is against them. So, therefore, according to the European Union, these are religious, political manifestations which cause terrorism. And if you have a look at, as I said earlier, if you have a look at the actions and the motivations and the declarations of the people who have committed terrorism, you will find it absolutely clear that their motivations are religious and political. And even in United Nations documents, and I'm talking about the most formal UN Security Council documents which have been written by a group of experts, in black and white, you will find that those people, the terrorists, came and asked the people their religion. They asked them why they did not convert. They showed them the Quran. They killed them. And after that, they said, we have killed the Kafirs. Now, this is official United Nations documents. If anyone wants, I can give the document number, etc., etc. So this is the phenomenon with which we are faced with, and it is exemplified in the actions of this terrorist, I will not take his name, who committed this act in New Orleans. And the world will have to reckon with it sooner or later. But unfortunately, what happens is that humans are very resilient. Time takes over. Time has its healing capacity, and therefore, the more time we put between the event and where we are, the immediacy, the horror, the encompassing nature of the challenge uh, fails, and then we go back to ordinary life. But this is a situation which is not going to go away, and people have been warning about it, that ISIS is back, and lo and behold, we have the tragedy before us.
Now, you said a very ominous warning that it is not going to go away. Then how do we live with it? What do we do with it? Just tolerate it, suffer it, let the lives be lost, and they continue to dominate our cultural and social milieu in which we can't celebrate anything. And that's what is important about the whole process. That what they are doing now is that any public event becomes a target with a
Right.
vehicle or anything else. So, how does one deal with that? The lone wolf theory, what is in the mind of these people that, lets them do it what they do? And this is a serious issue because today is New Orleans, yesterday was some other place. You had in Queens, close to your neighborhood, there was an attack on a nightclub. This is a problem that has begun and it becomes a commonplace. And that when something becomes commonplace, it creates a kind of an inertia in
Right.
people. All right, if it happens, that is what is important for people to understand, that you cannot allow these kind of things to continue. Tell us something more about that.
So, the first thing which we have to do is, in terms of quantification, Vibhutiji,
Yeah.
what is the extent of this problem, right? That's
Yeah.
the first thing which we need to establish in a factual sense. Now, there is a French think tank which has done a tremendous amount of work, and it has catalogued the number of terrorist attacks, Islamist terrorist attacks around the world from 1979 to October 2024,
Okay.
all over the world. Now, why have they chosen 1979? Well, there was a seizure of the Grand Mosque, and then the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. Then Ayatollah Khomeini had come to power in Iran, and also there was a failure of Arab nationalism, at that time. So they have done a yeoman work in recording the number of terrorist incidents, Islamist terrorist incidents from 1979 to today, and the number comes to about 62,000. More than 62,000 terrorist incidents, which have taken more than 250,000 lives. And the number of terrorist attacks which have happened in the decade 2013 to 2023 is the highest ever, is the highest ever. So therefore, although the US might not have been affected, it happened in 2001, but the fact is that Islamist terror is a scourge which has spread throughout the world. And in Europe, the France is the worst affected country. We've talked about how it has been affected in America also. But in terms of, what do we do about it? The first thing which you have to do about it, that you have to understand what is the mindset, right? And now, how do you do that? How do you do that? The easiest way to understand the mindset is to look at what the ideology says about itself. And this is not our comment on them, this is their comment on them. So let's have a look at that. First, the first thing is that how does Islam view itself? It views itself not as a religion alone, but it views itself as a complete code of life, which is political, social, economic, cultural, ethical, international. So once it says that we are a complete code of life, it can, from our point of view, no longer be regarded only as a religion in which there is a personal relationship between the believer and the supernatural, but taking actions which inevitably impact secular life. So, in that sense, Each one of these areas in which it makes a claim to be a solution have to be examined from the point of view what our morals and laws and cultural convictions are. For instance, if they say, well, we have a right to, marry 4 women, and that is something which is against certainly Judeo-Christian values in India also, and we have a legitimate right to resist that. But they consider all these things as an inalienable part of their religion. And therefore, the first thing we have to understand is in what facets of life are they laying claims? That's number one. Number two, forgive me, I'm just going to be slightly long in this one, but I
Yeah,
want the viewers. Is the light shining too much at the back, or
yeah,
is it
it's
okay?
on your right above your
Yeah,
left
yeah.
shoulder. Yeah,
So
yeah,
let me just,
yeah.
is
This is
that
better.
better?
This is better. Go ahead.
So the other thing is to have a look at what their seminal documents say. One of them is called the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1990. And this was modeled after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It has been heavily criticized. But what does it say? It says the Ummah is superior and it is the best nation made by God, and that its role is to guide a confused humanity guided by competing ideologies and materialism. So, therefore, they have set themselves up as superior and being a solution. That's one. Number two, if you have a look, there is also an organization which is the Islamic equivalent of UNESCO. That organization is called Islamic Social Cultural. It's exactly the same thing. You just put the word Islamic in front of it. Now, in 2000, it issued a strategy paper for
Mm.
Muslims living in non Muslim lands. What does this document say? It says that they should be convinced of their moral and ethical superiority, and that it is their duty that even in the second, third, and fourth generations, they should not lose their cultural identity and they should, quote, occupy key positions. So, this is what they have advocated to Muslims living in non Muslim lands. It is all in the public, right? Then you have a look at, for instance, what the International Institute of Islamic Thought says, that loyalty to a nation state is impossible and blasphemous for Muslims. So therefore, if you are, for instance, a Muslim in the United States, it's telling you you cannot be loyal to the United States. Now, obviously, the advice is not followed by all Muslims, but this is what they are telling us. After that, if you have a look at Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim country, and there is a Muslim organization out there which has put out a position paper statement and was interviewed in 2017 in Time magazine. Again, it is available for anyone to go and read, in which they said that the traditional relations between Muslims and non-Muslims is that of enmity and assimilation, and therefore they cannot live in peace with others. This is what the Muslim cleric from Indonesia has said. Now, none of this is my invention. None of this is made up by me. All these are facts. And therefore, we have to understand that this is how they think of themselves, in which it is a system in which they want to maintain their identity. They literally have no desire to integrate. And consequently, this is what we are seeing, a crisis of multiculturalism in Europe. And unless terrorism is an act which inevitably draws a lot of public attention, law enforcement action, but that is only the tip of the iceberg. And here is why I would suggest a conceptual framework which I have developed on how to understand this. Think of a triangle. On the top of a triangle, draw a small black triangle, which I call this is the violence by terrorists. Now you have the bottom of the triangle, which is still all white. What does that represent? That represents the majority of the Muslims. And what is their reaction? Their reaction is either silence or compliance or avoidance. So this is what we are faced with. Now, it doesn't mean that there are no reform-minded Muslims who are comfortable with all this kind of terrorism. There are literally millions of them. And I belong to a Clarity Coalition, which has got reformist Muslims and ex-Muslims, and it is doing fantastic work. And I suggest everybody should check up on that Clarity Coalition. It's led by Jasper Yudi, and it is also by Yasmin Muhammad. So these are very, very courageous people, who are doing this work. But some of them are the basic documents which I've talked about, and this is what people need to understand.
You talked about earlier that they are solution driven and they are superior. So
Right.
obviously, the intent is to dominate you and I and the likes of us and everybody who is not conforming to the Islamic way of life. And this our conversation is about understanding. As the saying goes, we have the beautiful word in our own language called Purva Paksh and Shatru Bodh, understanding the nature of the beast and understanding who you are dealing with. So, so while he's out of frame right now, okay, you're back. So the
Yeah.
question here that I have in mind is to ask about, recent stories about the grooming gangs in London, in UK. We know that that matter was suppressed by the entire British media and political system, and it was branded as the South Asian, whereas this was entirely Pakistani. you know this is what is important, how the words get translated in a particular way where people are trying to give them a benefit of doubt or suppress the truth from the rest of the world. So this is what is important, that they hit on our way of life, celebrations, public places, and also they talk about solution. They do the grooming gangs of abuses of children. And it was a very sad description that I saw yesterday on video, that a police officer from Metropolitan London, whatever the name is there, was saying that when they got a call and they went to the place, they found two underage girls, heavily drunk, naked, surrounded by dozens of Pakistani men. The kids were charged for being drunk and unorderly behavior, and they served terms in jail, in prison, and no charges were filed against any of the men who were there. So what we are looking at, that entire democracies and the Western democracy and Indian democracy and everywhere else, why are the people bending backwards to accommodate a faith that ostensibly is clear in its objective of ruling over you and dominating with their own agenda? What do we do about that?
So, about the grooming gangs, Elon Musk has recently, I think yesterday, tweeted about it. And this issue is back in the news in the UK.
Right.
And they have been demanding accountability. And many official reports have found that the reason why this was not followed is because of cultural sensitivities. They didn't want to spoil community relations. And therefore, the result was that literally thousands of girls have been subjected to this obscene term of grooming gangs. It makes it sound as if a person is going to a beauty parlor.
Right.
These women were raped, drugged, abused, and it was all one specific minority which was involved in that. They were Pakistani Muslims. They didn't even have the guts to say they were Pakistanis, and then they used the wider term South Asian grooming gangs, right? Now, in this case, what we have to understand is what are the weapons, what are the tools which they use. And one of the tools which they use is, not only preying on women, but even uh, their women, their food, their way of prayer is used as an instrumental tool of conquer. For instance, if you have a look at the hijab, the spread of the hijab means that it is a territory which belongs to them. It is under their cultural control. If you have a look at halal, it means that they are imposing their food choices on you. If they pray on the street, it means that they are taking over that place. So it is a total conquering system in which we have to understand that each one of these facets will have to be examined to have to struggle against. Because what we have seen in Europe is because of this political correctness, and I have a theory or a hypothesis of my own, that is the ideal of equality has been so badly misunderstood by Europe in thinking that everything is the same and therefore all religious ideologies are the same, and consequently we cannot treat anyone differently even though they are objectively different, is something which will have to be given up. And we have talked about, Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance. That is, to what extent are you going to tolerate intolerance? Because if you do that indefinitely, intolerance is going to overwhelm and defeat tolerance. And the way to do it, I think, and I'm writing about it right now, it is a new concept which I've come up with, is something called Islamofactism. And that is, without any hatred for any Muslims, without any hatred, one must be able to speak the facts about them. One must be able to put it in the public sphere, because the first duty of the government is to protect citizens, and the first duty of intellectuals and people who think is to make sure that there is no loss of life, that human life is valued, that people are able to survive in harmony, that they are able to flourish, and that we have to fight against ideologies which claim that they are superior, but in fact are something which are bent on, conquest, and they do not know the meaning of defeat, or they do not know the meaning of opposition.
Tell me something about you refer to the Friday prayers and the public domination. Why is it that none of the countries in the world have succeeded in doing something about this public prayers on Fridays? Interestingly enough, in many parts of the Islamic world, it is not allowed. But in the West, it is allowed. In India, it is allowed. In many other democracies, it is allowed. The right freedom of religion. Now, the question here again is twofold. One is the political system relying upon political correctness and sacrificing individual and public safety, right? We are not able to address that. Whereas they have definitely mastered the art of three V's, as I call it: vote bank in democracy, violence on the street, and claiming victimhood. You and I are responsible for their plight. They are not. How does one deal with that? How I mean, this is a very serious issue, that how will the rest of the world deal with that? And I'm backing it with the background of that is the famous UAE minister whose video is circulated all over the world, in which he chastises the Europeans and the democracies. You don't get us. You claim to understand us. We know them better, but this is what they are going to do to you because you allow them to do it. How does one deal with that?
So, the answer is very simple and very difficult at the same time. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. It is very simple because literally all you have to do is to enforce the law impartially, right? I'm not talking about any new laws. I'm not talking about emergency powers. I'm not talking about the midnight knock. I'm not talking about racial profiling. All I'm saying is, what are the laws in effect, and are you going to enforce them? Let me give you an example. For instance, uh, if there is a general law that you will not have public prayers, and if they insist on public prayers, well, you just enforce the law and say you are not allowed to do that. We are not discriminating against you. That is the law for everybody, right? The other thing, for instance, is that is the veto of the street power, the veto of violence. And that is something which they wield to tremendous effect. That is violence which breaks out, in which public disorder is threatens, public disorder descends, and consequently the state feels that they cannot go against these people. Now, in this case, again, take out the religious identity of the people who are involved, whether they be Muslims, Hindus, Christians, or whatever it is. if the same law applied to everybody, that look, if we say something about your religion, which is factually correct, and you decide that you're going to resort to mass violence, then you should expect the full force of the law. Am I asking for any new laws? No, I'm not asking for any new laws. The solution, Vibhuti, is very, very simple and very difficult at the same time. That is the impartial, inevitable, universal application of the law of the land, whether in terms of speech, whether in terms of law, whether in terms of incitation to violence. And that is what we are doing because we have misunderstood the nature of equality. We think that cultures with different values are the same, whereas the real law of equality should be that we have to apply the law without distinction of the religious nature or identity of the person or the group. That is the simple and only answer.
The application of law equally and unbiased and rigorous, that is the actual problem.
Yes.
Because in democracies, you have the unfortunate scenario where specific groups are able to do whatever they want to do, applying political pressure, which is emanating from the three V's that I talked about earlier on: vote bank, violence on the street, and victimhood. So the moment you begin to pander and appease to these ideologies or that tactic, you become, weak. And that's where people take advantage of that. Now, I will come to the remaining time that I have. I have two more questions to go about. One is very important, is my favorite phrase, which you are familiar with, and my audience must be familiar with. I always say, knowing what we know now, where do we go from here? With reference to counterintelligence, with reference to counterterrorism, how does one deal with? And I have done courses in counterterrorism in the US, and I understand that. But as one police officer in India had told me, we know everything. It is the political will that is required to do certain things. Your thoughts on that?
Right. So the question is, what are we supposed to do? Depends upon who you are, right? Now, if you are a politician, if you are a citizen, if you are a concerned person, they are all different things which you can do, right? Now, let us have a look at the person who has no power, no authority, and is just a simple citizen. That person, the first thing he or she should do is inform themselves about the threat, and therefore be more informed about it and not simply place reliance on mainstream newspapers. Now, today, I would say that Elon Musk has started speaking some very, very uncomfortable truths. And that is the reason why he's getting so much attraction. That is the reason why, after the Magdeburg attack in Germany, he talked about the AFD and the establishment there is shaken. So the people who have got a significant amount of power, they have a far more of a responsibility to speak out about the truth, when they see it. In terms of newspapers, obviously they should recommit themselves to objectivity. And if you have a look at what happened in the grooming gangs case, the hundreds and thousands of women who have been abused, white women, Hindu women, Sikh women, essentially it was a failure of, it was the iron law of political correctness. Now, if they had done their duty, this would not have happened. If they had enforced the law, this would not have happened. So, number one, inform yourself about the nature of the threat, about what this ideology says about itself. It considers itself a complete philosophy which is applicable to all phases of life. Juxtapose that with your civilizational values and say, hey, I don't agree with this. I need to talk about it. I need to push back about it. And then, in terms of the politicians, a fatal flaw in democracy obviously is the number of voters. And the more the numbers increase, the more pliable, the more spineless, the more elusive these people are going to get. And in that sense, ultimately, they can be a revolt to the people, say, look, we will not stand any further. And in that sense, I read recently, they said, you know what? The left is responsible for the right. In other words, what they meant was that the left has avoided and covered up so many vital public issues for such a long time that the public has no alternative but to go to these parties who are speaking the truth more to them.
Mm.
So, in that sense, knowledge, action, and we cannot be afraid. If they say you cannot talk about Islam, we will not accept that. Nobody should accept that. Again, this is nothing to do with, there is absolutely no incitation of violence, hate. Everybody in this world is entitled to live peacefully, including all Muslims brothers and sisters. But when ideologies conflict, when there is aggression, when there is an intent to dominate and to destroy, then if we do not act, then we are culpable in our own demise.
We are culpable in our own demise. Fabulously said. Now, this is where I make a follow up question on this one. Individuals can be intimidated. The tool that the terrorists use is that attack a Rahul Sur, attack a Vibhuti Jha because they dare to talk about it. Attack a Nupur Sharma because she quoted from the Hadith and the Sharia that you have no right to talk about us. Individuals get scared because they value life. They say, let it go. It's none of my business. Let the government deal with that. But individuals are responsible for their own actions. Mahabharata and Ramayana has taught us one definitely clear thing, which is my understanding, that we are responsible for whatever choices we make and decisions we take. So if we choose to remain silent, if we choose to accept the atrocities, then we suffer. What's your advice to people, individuals? How will the individual respond to this? Particularly when their expectations are that the government machinery must act, as you rightly said, apply the law, existing laws, equitably and rightfully. What does the individual do in this scenario? And I have one more question to go over that after this conversation. Yes.
So, this question about the individual is, let us understand and let us sympathize in the shoes of the ordinary men and women. They are concerned rightly with their own lives. They're concerned with living peaceful lives. They have so many, responsibilities, and they don't want to take on this added responsibility of speaking out on this dangerous topic.
Right.
Now, in that case, a greater responsibility devolves on people who consider themselves leaders, because whether we like it or not, people follow leaders. So therefore, we have to try to build an ecosystem in which more concerned people who are inclined towards speaking out on public issues speak out on that, so that there is a trickle down effect of courage and contagion, which will give hope and encouragement to them. But we must not expect all ordinary men and women to speak out, because they are rightfully concerned in their own lives. They don't want disruption. This is an absolutely unnecessary headache. It is dangerous. So therefore, it's for people, for brave people who are your viewers, who are interested. Douglas Murray, who's written a fantastic book, hats off to the man. We have really, really courageous individuals. We have, Yasmin Mohammed in our Clarity Coalition, Asra Nomani, many, many, women who are speaking out against it. They are the ones who are setting the trend. So therefore, more hats off to them, more power to the elbow. And the people who think of themselves as having some kind of, public conscience need to speak out more, so that this burden of the ordinary, man and woman is a little bit lifted, and so that their lives are easier. So essentially, it is a system of graduated responsibilities, with the heavier responsibilities lying on those who think themselves open to these issues, and certainly the most responsibilities lies on the officials and the leaders, whose chosen responsibility it is to guide societies.
And you said it correctly, because eventually it is from the individual that action begins. You named Ashra Nomani and several others, and including, Ayan Ali Hirsi. I mean, her case is
Bayan
a
Hirsi Ali.
bizarre. Yeah, Ayan
Yes.
Ali Hirsi. I mean, it was a bizarre case. Even in America, she was not allowed the freedom of speech to talk about the political Islam that she has endured, suffered, and has been terrorized as. You know, Asra Nomani rose up, wrote the fabulous book, and she has come on our shows in the past. The question here is very simple. The individual gets intimidated. Not everybody has the same extent of courage. But then what you are probably saying that, you need to mobilize, gather courage, emerge out of that. My final question of the day, and that's very important because, in psychology, there is a word called generalization. We need not and we must not generalize everybody under the same brush. There are many Muslims who are not subscribing to this Islamic terrorism part of it. What does one have to do with that? Because a lot of people will blame you and me. Even those people we are trying to protect and defend, their rights. They will accuse that you are Islamophobic. So
Right.
when people are saying that, we are not like that, they are different, but their silence, you had alluded to that in an earlier statement. How does one motivate them to speak up? What do we do about that? Well,
Right.
those people who are not part of it.
So the first thing which I'd say is that violence is completely unacceptable. That there are literally millions of peaceful Muslims, and there should be absolutely no feeling of hatred towards them. They have as much of a right as everybody to live in peace, harmony, and security, and they are living. However, there are two important issues which I want to point out. One is that when you look at the database of Islamist attacks from 1979 to 2024 October, the primary victims of these, 85% of them have happened in Muslim countries. So therefore, they are literally the overwhelming numbers of the victims of these attacks. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that merely because they are the primary victims of the attacks, it somehow justifies the attacks which have happened in Western countries. Now, the second thing which I said is that there has been a lot of research and a lot of statements which are made about quote unquote millions of peaceful Muslims, and that is correct. But there is another aspect, that is the issue of what is the number of Muslims who support this in silence or in compliance. And studies have been done on this. Thorough research has been conducted in this by the Pew Research, by the European Union. And let me just give you a couple of examples. In 2017, the European Union did a comprehensive survey on Muslims in Europe, which it says is a representative sample. In other words, in methodological terms, the findings are applicable to all of Muslims living out there. And what they found was that 11% of Muslims, which is there around about 27, 28 million Muslims in Europe, which comes to about 2.3%, 11% of them thought that violence was okay, if somebody had insulted their religion. And the same percentage exists in the United States. So very small minorities, which translate into literally hundreds and thousands, if not millions of Muslims, have this tendency to support this violence. And this is not only me saying it, this is the European Union. This is Pew Research. And this is exactly what was said by Sajid Javed, who was a Muslim UK Home Secretary, in which he said he called on, quote, fellow Muslims to speak out against non-violent extremists, right? So therefore, violence is not only the ultimate manifestation of violence, of course, is terrorism, but there is a violent mindset. There is support for violence. There is turning away from violence. And then I turn back to my conceptual model of the triangle, in which the top is the small triangular top is violence, and the bottom is silence, compliance, and avoidance. Now, in the case of New Orleans, the mosque which this person was attending has advised its followers not to speak to the FBI and to refer them to care. They didn't say you must cooperate fully with the law enforcement. They didn't say they talked about the safety of their community. The Muslim community is foremost. There was no expression of regret for or feeling sorry for the people who had been killed. So, what does this tell us? These are very disquieting things which are coming from here, which people prefer to sweep under the carpet. But merely because you sweep them under the carpet doesn't mean that they cease to exist. So we have to treat it as a whole of ideology effort, and we have to counter it as a whole of ideology. Merely countering violence, which is a manifestation of terrorism, with force is not going to do it.
You said it very correctly that silence, compliant, and what do you call
Avoidance.
it? Avoidance. We as individuals have to become aware of that and act on it. You do not act on it, you suffer. That's a very simple prescription. And this is what is important for all of us to understand. That's why we are talking. We are talking not because we hate X or Y. We are concerned about tomorrow, it can happen in your neighborhood, in my neighborhood. It can happen to a mall you go to. It can happen to a restaurant you go to. You do not know who is next, the lone wolf or the organized. This New Orleans thing, the FBI has already told us that it was not act of one person alone. It was a coordinated attack. It can't be a lone wolf because IEDs were supplied, they were installed. Things like that are very important. And we, each one of us, have, I won't say the moral responsibility, each one of us have, our given right of self-defense, protect and defend your family, my family, our communities. But this kind of an attack on a public place, on a public event, cannot be allowed because it makes it very critical for us. Which event do you go to? Now, Pannun has given a threat from here that he's going to attack Kumbh Mela that is going to happen in India. This is what is serious, that people are taking advantage of our way of life to threaten our way of life. And that's what is important. And one final word which I want to share with you. Remember, when you strike a compromise, in a compromise, truth is always the victim. The right is always the victim. You cannot have a compromise between 2 drops of poison and a gallon of milk. Think about that analogy. It's very important to do that because if you relent on your strength and you try to give in, you are the loser. So there is a point at which you need to stand firm, this far and no further. The Lakshman Rekha has to be made a reality. And that's what is important. So thank you very much for staying with us, watching us. Thank you, Rahulji, immensely for such a studious and such a profound advice that you have given. And I also want to say, I always end up by saying, Satyame Vijayate, for truth to triumph, you and I have to stand up for it. Thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you, Vibhuti Ji. I just want to say one thing, that in fact the FBI has now clarified that he did act alone. Their previous supposition was, their hypothesis was that he was acting with people. Now they have said that he acted alone.
Okay.
So that's what it is. But nevertheless, the fact that one person was able to wreak such havoc should not give us any comfort that he was not with other people, although it would have been worse if he had been other people. Thank God he was not. But that doesn't detract from the immense damage this evil person has already done. And I would advise all your viewers to stay strong, to stay informed, and to never ever, put your head down, because being brave is the only way to live.
Thank you for updating with the FBI report because this is a fast moving arena because everything is alleged and information changes from time to time. So thank you very much, Rahulji, for updating the audience and listeners for this part. But lone wolf is a theory. Remember one thing, it's always the ideology of the mind drives people. So while words change minds, minds move mountains. And what is moving this mountain? The mind, the theology, the ideology. And that's what we have to contest. That this far and no further. Thank you once again.
Namaste.
Namaste.